on the afternoon of June 22, 1941, as German army groups north, center, and south crossed the Soviet border in the largest land invasion in the history of warfare. Adolf Hitler sat in his headquarters at the Wolf's Lair in East Prussia and made a decision that no one in his military staff had requested, no operational logic supported. And that would, in the judgment of nearly every serious military historian who has examined it since, cost Germany the war at the precise moment it appeared to. He would not make it for another 7 weeks. But the logic that would produce it was already present in every conversation he was having with his generals, in every map briefing he was conducting, in every assessment he was offering of what the campaign he had just launched was supposed to achieve. The decision was not a single order issued on a single day. It was a philosophical position about the purpose of the war, a position that contradicted the operational requirements of the campaign he had designed. And it would express itself catastrophically at the one moment when the military situation demanded something his philosophy could not provide. The decision was to turn the main armored weight of the German advance away from Moscow in August 1941, at the moment when the Soviet capital was within operational reach, and redirect it south toward Ukraine. It is a decision that military historians mention. It is a decision that appears in every serious account of Operation Barbarossa. And yet, in the broader popular understanding of why Germany lost the Second World War, it receives a fraction of the attention devoted to the Battle of Britain or Stalingrad or D-Day events that came after, and that were made possible by this earlier, quieter, more consequential choice. This is the story of what Hitler decided in the summer of 1941, why every senior German general opposed it, why Hitler overruled them, and why the debate about whether he was right or catastrophically wrong is not nearly as settled as the war's outcome might suggest, and why the truth, when examined carefully, is more damning than the simple narrative of a dictator ignoring his professionals. To understand the decision, you have to understand what the German military had achieved in the first 8 weeks of Barbarossa and why that achievement, extraordinary as it was simultaneously insufficient for the strategic objectives the campaign required. By the middle of August 1941, Army Group Center had advanced approximately 700 kilometers from the Polish border to a position near Smolensk, roughly 400 kilometers west of Moscow. In the process, it had destroyed or captured the equivalent of the entire peacetime Red Army multiple times over. The Minsk pocket in late June and early July had yielded approximately 290,000 Soviet prisoners. The Smolensk pocket in July and early August added another 310,000. The speed of the advance had been, by any historical standard, extraordinary, unprecedented in scale, and largely unmatched in pace by any previous land campaign. But Halder and the German army staff were looking at the maps with a growing unease that the victories were not entirely dispelling. The Soviet Union was not France. It was not Poland. It was a continental landmass of a size that the German campaign had not yet begun to reveal the full operational implications of. The distances from the German border to Moscow were greater than the distances from Moscow to the Urals. Beyond the Urals lay Siberia, and in Siberia there were factories and resources and populations that German air power could not reach, and German ground forces could not threaten in any timeline that the 1941 campaign could achieve. The German plan for Barbarossa had been built on a premise that was simultaneously a military assumption and an ideological conviction, that the Soviet state was so structurally fragile, so lacking in genuine popular legitimacy, that the destruction of its military forces in a series of rapid encirclements would cause the entire system to collapse from within. Halder had written in his war diary on July 3, 1941, his famous assessment that the campaign had been won in 14 days. He meant this not as hyperbole, but as operational analysis, The Soviet field armies that had been the primary instrument of Soviet military power had been destroyed faster than they could be replaced, and the destruction of those armies should, in his model, trigger the political and social collapse that would end organized resistance. The problem, which was becoming visible in the intelligence assessments crossing his desk through July and into August, was that the Soviet state was not collapsing. It was producing new armies. The replacements being fed into the line were often poorly trained, inadequately equipped, and organizationally inferior to the formations they were replacing. But they were there. They were fighting. And they were fighting in numbers that the original German intelligence assessment of Soviet mobilization capacity had not anticipated. This was the strategic situation in which Hitler made his decision. The argument within the German High Command about the direction of the main effort for the second phase of Barbarossa was one of the most consequential professional disagreements in the history of military planning, and it has been consistently misrepresented in popular accounts as a simple case of Hitler's intuition overruling his general's professional expertise. The reality was more complicated and more interesting. Halder and Brauchitsch command me continue the drive on Moscow. Their argument rested on classical operational logic that was entirely coherent within its own premises. Moscow was the Soviet Union's political capital, its communications hub, its rail center, and the symbolic heart of Soviet national identity. Capturing it would sever the north-south rail connections that linked the Soviet industrial regions to the front, disrupt the command and control infrastructure of the Soviet military, and deliver a psychological blow whose effects were difficult to calculate but which historical precedent Napoleon, whose capture of Moscow in 1812 had forced Alexander I to the negotiating table, though he had ultimately declined to negotiate, suggested would be profound. The road to Moscow was defended by the largest Soviet force, remaining in the field, the forces of Soviet Western and Reserve fronts that had been rebuilding since the Smolensk battles. Destroying those forces in front of Moscow would, in Halder's assessment, finally produce the collapse of organized Soviet resistance that the campaign had been designed to achieve. The momentum of Army Group Center's advance, maintained by the experienced troops and experienced commanders who had produced the extraordinary results of the first 8 weeks, was the most powerful military instrument available to Germany. Using that instrument against the primary objective made operational sense. Hitler's counterargument was not, as is sometimes presented, purely irrational or driven by economic greed at the expense of operational logic. It was a different operational assessment that rested on premises about what the campaign needed to achieve that were genuinely different from Halder's. Hitler's argument was that Moscow was a geographical objective whose capture would not, by itself, produce Soviet capitulation. The Soviet state had demonstrated, over the preceding 8 weeks, that it could absorb catastrophic losses and continue functioning. Simply taking Moscow would not end the war if the Soviet military capacity to continue fighting remained intact in Ukraine to the south, and in the industrial regions beyond the Urals to the east. What would end the war, in Hitler's assessment, was the destruction of the economic foundations that sustained Soviet military production, the agricultural wealth of Ukraine, the coal of the Donets Basin, the oil of the Caucasus that lay beyond it. Without food, without coal, and ultimately without oil, the Soviet war machine would stop regardless of where its capital was located. This argument was not without military merit. In the abstract, it addressed a real strategic problem that Halder's Moscow First approach did not fully resolve. Capturing Moscow, while leaving intact the Soviet economic base in Ukraine and the Caucasus, would have required Germany to continue fighting. A Soviet military that could draw on those resources indefinitely, and Germany's ability to sustain the campaign indefinitely was not guaranteed. The problem with Hitler's argument was not that it was strategically incoherent. The problem was the timing. The timing was everything. And the timing was dictated by a factor that Hitler's strategic vision consistently underweighted and that his generals understood. With the visceral certainty of men whose careers had been built on the operational reality of logistics, the Russian winter. Barbarossa had been launched on June 22, 1941, 6 weeks later than the original planning had intended. Delayed by the necessity of the Balkan campaign that had consumed German forces in Yugoslavia and Greece in April and May. Those 6 weeks were not operationally trivial. They were the difference between reaching the campaign's objectives before the Russian winter made sustained operations impossible and reaching those objectives, if reaching them was possible at all, in conditions that would turn every mechanical vehicle into a frozen wreck and every infantryman without adequate winter equipment into a casualty. The German army in 1941 had not been supplied with winter equipment. This was not an oversight born of ignorance. It was a consequence of the planning assumption that the campaign would be over before winter arrived. The assumption was reasonable given the original June start date and the expected pace of Soviet collapse. It was catastrophically unreasonable given the actual start date, the actual pace of Soviet resistance, and the actual distances involved. When Hitler redirected the armored weight of army group center southward in August to support the Kiev operation, he was making a decision that consumed approximately 6 weeks of the campaigning season. 6 weeks during which Army Group Center's panzers were not driving toward Moscow but were swinging south, completing the encirclement of Kiev, processing the largest single bag of prisoners in the history of warfare, approximately 650,000 Soviet soldiers captured when the Kiev pocket closed. In September, and then returning north to prepare for the renewed drive on Moscow that would become Operation Typhoon. Operation Typhoon launched on October 2, 1941. It launched into the autumn rains that turned Russian roads into impassable mud, the period Russian soldiers called the Rasputitsa, the time without roads. By the time the mud froze, hard enough for mechanized movement, the calendar had moved into November. By the time German advance elements reached the outskirts of Moscow, some units could see the spires of the Kremlin. Through their binoculars in early December, the temperature had fallen to -35 degrees Celsius, and the German army had been in sustained combat for 5.5 months without winter equipment. The Moscow offensive stalled, not because of Soviet military genius, though Zhukov's defensive management of the battle was skillful. It stalled because German soldiers were suffering frostbite casualties in numbers that exceeded battle casualties. Because tank engines would not start in temperatures for which their lubricants had not been formulated. Because artillery recoil mechanisms froze. Because the men who had driven 700 kilometers in 2 months were, by December 1941, exhausted beyond any threshold of sustainable operations. The 6 weeks that Kiev consumed were the 6 weeks that Moscow required. This is the argument that Halder made before the decision, recorded in his war diary with the controlled fury of a professional who believes, is watching a decisive mistake being made and cannot prevent it. And this is the argument that the subsequent history appears to validate. But the history is not quite as simple as the argument suggests. And understanding why requires taking Hitler's counterargument more seriously than popular history typically does. The Kiev operation, whatever it cost in time, destroyed a Soviet force that would otherwise have been available to contest the Moscow approach or, more dangerously, to strike the exposed southern flank of Army Group Center as it drove east. The 650,000 Soviet soldiers captured at Kiev were not trivial. They were the equivalent of an entire strategic army group, and their destruction removed from the Soviet order of battle a force whose presence would have complicated the Moscow operation in ways that are difficult to model but impossible to dismiss. The debate among historians about whether the Moscow First approach would have succeeded is Ultimately, a debate about counterfactuals, about a history that didn't happen, and counterfactuals about military operations in 1941. Soviet conditions are not susceptible to confident resolution. General Halder, who commanded armored forces in the Moscow approaches and wrote extensively about the operation after the war, believed that a late September start, what the Kiev diversion had prevented, would have given German forces Moscow before the winter closed in. General Blumentritt thought the same. Halder, who spent the post-war years building the historical case for the general's superior judgment against Hitler's interference, was predictably convinced. What they all shared was a belief that the timing was the decisive variable. Whether Moscow would have fallen if reached in late September is a question the record cannot answer. What the record can answer is that Moscow was not reached in September, and that the forces which came within binocular range of the Kremlin in December 1941 were too exhausted, too cold, and too depleted to take it. What Hitler's decision cost Germany was not necessarily Moscow. What it cost Germany was certainty, the certainty of a concentrated offensive executed in the optimal season with forces at their peak of operational effectiveness. By trading that certainty for the operational completeness that the Kiev encirclement provided, Hitler chose the larger, immediate victory over the potentially decisive strategic one, and in a campaign where time was the resource Germany could least afford to spend. That trade expressed a fundamental misunderstanding of what the war required. The deeper reason the decision doomed Germany has less to do with Moscow specifically than with what the failure to take Moscow in 1941 meant for everything that followed. A Soviet Union with Moscow intact going into the winter of 1941 to 1942 was a Soviet Union that had survived the greatest military campaign in history against the most effective military machine in the world, in the most favorable conditions that machine would ever operate under. Every subsequent year of the war would see German operational conditions deteriorate and Soviet operational conditions improve. The factories evacuated to the Urals would begin producing. American Lend-Lease would begin arriving. The Red Army would absorb its catastrophic losses and begin developing the institutional capacity for the kind of adaptive, initiative-driven operations that Barbarossa had revealed it lacked. None of this was inevitable in October 1941. A Soviet government that had lost its capital, its primary rail hub, and the symbol of Soviet national identity to German occupation was a Soviet government under pressures that are genuinely difficult to assess from the historical distance of a war that ended differently. Stalin had already prepared his own evacuation from Moscow in October 1941, though he ultimately did not leave. The political impact of a German occupation of Moscow, whether it would have produced the negotiated peace Hitler hoped for or simply moved the Soviet government east and continued the war from Kuybyshev, is a question the record cannot answer. What it can answer is the consequence of not finding out. By failing to take Moscow in 1941, Germany committed itself to a war of attrition against a continental power with greater long-term resources, greater long-term manpower. And, once the industrial evacuation was complete and Lend-Lease was flowing greater long-term productive capacity, it committed itself to this war in December 1941. The same month, Japan attacked Pearl Harbor and Hitler declared war on the United States, transforming a European war into a global one in which Germany faced the combined industrial output of the Soviet Union, the British Empire, and the United States. From that December, the question was not whether Germany would lose. It was how long it would take and how many people would die before it happened. Hitler made other decisions that accelerated the defeat, the declaration of war, on America. The order to stand fast at Stalingrad, the refusal to authorize strategic retreats that could have preserved German forces for more effective resistance. Each of these has been analyzed extensively and each contributed to the final result. But the decision in August 1941 to turn south, at the moment when the road to Moscow was open, consuming the weeks and the operational momentum that the campaign could not recover, was the decision that created the context in which all the subsequent decisions were made. It was made in a moment of German strength, against the unanimous advice of the generals, who understood the operational requirements most clearly, in pursuit of a strategic vision that was not wrong in its analysis of Soviet economic vulnerabilities, but was catastrophically wrong in its understanding of what the campaign had time to achieve. No one talks about it the way they talk about Stalingrad. No one dramatizes it the way they dramatize the Battle of Britain. There are no famous last stands, no single commanding personality whose story can carry a film. No moment of obvious catastrophe visible to ordinary soldiers in the way that a city burning or a beach defended was visible. There was only a decision on a map, made in a headquarters in East Prussia in August 1941, that traded the decisive for the complete and got neither. And the war that followed, for more years of it, tens of millions of dead, a continent in ruins, was the price of that trade. If you found this story compelling, please take a moment to like this video. Your support helps us continue sharing important stories from the Second World War that deserve to be remembered. Subscribe to join our community of history enthusiasts from around the world. We would love to hear from you in the comments, whether you have family connections to this history or simply appreciate learning about the past. Thank you for watching, and thank you for helping keep these stories alive for future generations.